Recent economic challenges have many in government touting the benefits of a national industrial policy. Our next guest raises questions about that approach. Scott Lincicome is a senior fellow in economic studies at the libertarian Cato Institute, and his new research report on this topic is titled Questioning Industrial Policy: Why Government Manufacturing Plans Are Ineffective and Unnecessary. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Good to be back.
So the United States does face a number of economic challenges, geopolitical challenges, but you say as these are taking place, we shouldn't be jumping on this bandwagon of industrial policy again.
Right. The United States has strengths and weaknesses like every country, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. When you look at the history of industrial policy as applied in the United States, when you look at the actual experience of a lot of other countries, there's really not a lot of great arguments for copying other countries' industrial policies, particularly those in state capitalist China, in some sort of effort to compete with China or beat the market in essential technologies and critical goods.
Your paper is titled Questioning Industrial Policy, and you really lay out some 4 questions that are key to this debate. The first one, what is industrial policy? I'm guessing a lot of people watching this will want to know, what are we talking about?
Well, and especially because, as I note in the paper, industrial policy advocates in the United States these days tend to attribute every major innovation almost to industrial policy, whether it's the iPhone or the internet or GMO corn or satellites, and I could go on and on. The way they do this, however, is by using such a broad definition of industrial policy as to essentially render it useless. And what you see throughout the history books, however, when you look back at past episodes of actual U.S. industrial policy, is that there are several really defining characteristics. Defining characteristics that when you apply those to all those things I just mentioned, they really weren't the result of industrial policy at all. Instead, it was an occasional maybe government grant somewhere along the chain that maybe someone used to produce one part of a product that eventually was incorporated by private business, but really lacked, again, these essential elements. So obviously the question is, what are these essential elements? So the first is you need some sort of overarching national plan, some sort of national strategy.
Central planning, it
right.
sounds like.
Well, and it's to achieve some sort of core national objective, national security or innovation or these types of things. So you have this strategic plan. And then the second thing you do is you implement targeted and directed government policies, things like tariffs or subsidies, to achieve market-beating commercial objectives. So that's also important because the commercial side of this, people will say, well, the Defense Department spent $50 billion on a fighter jet, and along the way we discovered the satellite imagery or something. Industrial policy. But that's, again, not really what industrial policy is. Industrial policy is where the government uses, again, these mechanisms to try to beat the market in obtaining commercial things, so things that we use in our everyday lives, things like the iPhone, for example. So the government would not be kind of stumbling upon something, and certainly not for defense-related purposes, but instead would really say, we want to invent this product, and we're going to pay a company or an individual to do it, and we've succeeded. Now, I think the last part of this that's essential is that it has to be, there's an element of economic nationalism to this. So this is important because what the government is essentially saying is whatever outcomes they're trying to produce, whether it's manufacturing jobs or new green energy or whatever, it needs to be done within national borders. So it needs to be done by an American company, by American workers. So I think a classic contrast is when is in climate change and climate technologies. So a non-industrial policy approach would be the government simply imposing a carbon tax or unilaterally lowering import restrictions on green goods from around the world, and then letting the market do its thing. Whereas an industrial policy approach would be for the government to say, we want to lower carbon emissions, so we're going to subsidize specific products, solar panels and windmills, and they have to be made in the United States using American technologies. And you can see, I think, from that contrast that there's a clear delineation between those two approaches. And it's the latter approach, that industrial policy approach, that really has run into a lot of problems in the past.
Your second big question leading into that is, what are some of the common obstacles to effective U.S. industrial policy?
Right, and this again goes through the history books. So you can, we act a lot. Government acts a lot these days like industrial policy is this new thing. We need to adopt this new industrial policy, but they ignore that the United States has flirted with industrial policy for decades. I'd say the most relevant episodes for our purposes in terms of learning experience are in the 1980s and 90s. We embraced all sorts of subsidies and tax credits and protectionism and tariffs and managed trade, trying to boost our semiconductors industry or trying to boost the auto industry and these other industries. So if you look at that episode, and then right after the Great Recession, the Obama administration was a big fan of industrial policy in the environmental goods space. So again, solar panels and the like. So when you look at these episodes and then combine them with some others, some problems emerge pretty quickly. The first is the classic knowledge problem by Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek, which is really the idea that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for government planners to figure out all of the complexities and nuances of the market, because the market is changing every day and it involves millions upon millions of inputs from people like you and me and from customers. And it's those interactions that really feed the market process and allow for the best information through price signals and the rest to generate new innovations, new technologies and the rest. Well, if you look at the history books, government planners have a really impossible time trying to surmount the knowledge problem. So you see examples of this. One of my favorite examples is that the United States determined decades ago that we wanted to lead the world in memory chips for semiconductors. Well, what they didn't know at the time was that memory chips were kind of going out of fashion, and that in fact it was logic chips that were really going to be the big, innovative, high dollar thing. So we did all these subsidies and protectionism to protect and subsidize a low value, low volume product. Not only that, we picked the wrong country. We went after Japan, thus fueling the rise of Korea. And Korea is now a major player in the chips market. And so that type of unintended consequence, those types of innovations, it's really difficult for government to get a grasp of. Now the next big one, as I'm sure some viewers here know about, is politics, or what we call, public choice theory, which is really just the idea that governments and government actors are humans. They act according to their own personal preferences and their own impulses, and they also act in a self-interested way, not in the public interest, as sometimes you think of. Well, public choice, which is, again, goes back to a Nobel laureate Buchanan and Tulloch. So they say, well, look, there are all sorts of ways that in the planning process of government policy, politicians put their thumb on the scale for political ends, whether it's to benefit certain constituents or to achieve re-election. And those processes tend to undermine, again, the efficacy of industrial policies that might look good on paper, but once they're implemented, tend to fall apart. So if you go back, for example, to those green energy subsidies I mentioned during the Obama administration, well, subsidies show time and time again that the project awards actually went to companies that weren't the most meritorious, but actually who lobbied the most. We also,
Shocking.
yes, I know, right, exactly. But we also saw things like technologies that the Department of Energy chose were focused in clean coal technology, which was not one of the most promising or innovative areas for energy research. But coal has a lot of political backers on both sides of the aisle. President Obama's own state of Illinois had a big carbon capture project that got funded, which again was achieved for political purposes, not for actual on grounds of merit. So, again, when you factor in, you have knowledge problem issues, then you factor in public choice issues, you run into a lot of, I think, obstacles. And it's important to note that a lot of these programs, they said, no, we're going to actually insulate this from the political process. We're going to give it to a bunch of bureaucrats that aren't elected officials. They're going to have a mandate to go achieve some great objective, and it'll be insulated. But what we again see is that it's really difficult in practice for the bureaucrats not to be affected by politicians who, of course, control their budgets. And even the bureaucrats themselves, again, are self-interested. So they might be overcautious because they're worried about keeping their jobs. Or they might simply need the industry to give them the knowledge they don't have, what we call industry capture or regulatory capture. And thus, the industry ends up dictating the rules under which the industry is being regulated or being subsidized or protected, and again, undermining the efficacy of these programs. So then the third big hurdle for industrial policy is a real lack of discipline regarding scope and duration or objectives. And we see this in things like the Jones Act, which protects United States shipping industry, or several projects in the energy space. Again, there was a great book back in the 1990s called The Technology Pork Barrel. And what these authors from the Brookings Institution did was they went and they looked at 6 different demonstration projects throughout the 70s and 80s. And they tried to determine if any of these were actually worth all of the money that we spent. And they found that not only did we blow through the budgets, but also that 5 out of the 6 projects continued for long after failure had been established. Well, why did they continue? Why weren't they shut down? Well, politics again rears its ugly head. It turns out that these projects had, over time, developed really strong constituencies in the location where they're located. It's kind of like a military base in this sense, right? Once people become dependent on that program, well, the political champions who typically represent those areas are going to fight tooth and nail to keep them alive. So time and time again, industrial policies suffer from this. And then finally, there are a host of seen and unseen costs attached to industrial policies. Now, we talked about budgetary issues. Industrial policies routinely blow through their line item budgets, and that includes some when entities like the Department of Energy will use very creative accounting methods to try to hide some of their costs, which the Obama administration famously did with respect to Solyndra and some of those renewable energy programs. But it's not just the seen cost. It turns out that there are a host of unseen costs that never go accounted for. So, I think one of the big ones, we mentioned unintended consequences, American semiconductor protectionism against Japan, fueling the growth of South Korea's industry. That's a great example of those unintended consequences. But there's also opportunity costs. So opportunity costs is essentially the idea that money that we spent, that was allocated for a certain project, really could have been better spent elsewhere. Because since federal budgets are finite, even today, it's in the trillions, but there's still a cap. So that money could have been spent better elsewhere. So, for example, instead of bailing out GM and Chrysler after the Great Recession, we could have spent that money on worker retraining and thus let the market do its thing with respect to more competitive companies, including Ford and also foreign automakers here in the United States. And by not allowing those processes to work, we unleashed a host of other potential unseen costs, potentially undermining bankruptcy law because bondholders in those companies got shafted, and on with the potential problems. And so when you look at all of these seen and unseen costs, you see that really the cost side is much, much greater than the potential benefits. And that's even if we hit it rich. We strike it rich on something like a Tesla, for example, which has received some government money. It turns out that the total portfolio for that program was far more than the loans that went to Tesla. But not only that, the interruption of the market process. Those loans, for example, crowded out private investment in electric vehicles. We also saw in that same time that non-subsidized alternatives emerged without government help. And I think that's the other really big unseen thing going on here. And I think the best example of that is with the vaccines. So, here you had some subsidized companies like Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, but there also was an unsubsidized drug maker in Pfizer. Pfizer and Germany's BioNTech got together. They famously refused government upfront money. They did all testing and research by themselves. And the only government money they ended up taking was for procurement. But they didn't have any micromanagement of their supply chains, which spanned the globe. There was no economic nationalism. None of those conditions that I said were in traditional industrial policy. And they produced, well, one of the most prolific, if not the most prolific and successful vaccine of them all. And so that counterfactual is really often missing from industrial policy debates. They often say, aha, look, we subsidized one company, it turned out to be great, aha, industrial policy works. Well, never mind all those unseen costs, but also never mind what the free market could have done, which I think, again, in the case of Pfizer and BioNTech, we can see that. It's really important as we consider industrial policies going forward.
You mentioned two other questions. We're not going to get to them, but I will mention them. What problems will industrial policy solve? Yeah. And also, what do other countries' industrial policies mean for what the U.S. should do? After this discussion that we've had at this point, I want to jump ahead to your bottom line. Yeah. I'm guessing it's not going to surprise anyone, based on what you've said, that you think the U.S. should not go down this path.
Right. So you mentioned a couple key issues, and the fact is that when you look at some of the justifications for industrial policy, whether it's declining deindustrialization or declining manufacturing jobs, or the fact that China has an industrial policy, what you see is that those justifications really ring hollow. There's not only is the United States manufacturing sector doing pretty well, but there's actually a lot of problems with China's own industrial policies. And I think as we're seeing now in China, they're having some significant economic problems of their own. So what should we do? Well, we shouldn't copy those failed policies. We shouldn't try to revive an industry that doesn't need reviving. Instead, we really need to embrace what the United States has done well and what has made America great for all these years, and that's economic openness and free markets and a low and predictable tax and regulatory regime, an openness to immigrants and foreign trade, and really letting private businesses invest and adapt according to whatever the market throws at them. And we've seen that throughout the pandemic. We've seen, yes, grocery store shelves were empty for a little while. Yes, there have been supply chain hiccups. But what's unseen is that private businesses, private investors in the United States and abroad are constantly working and adjusting to make the next best thing or address the last problem. And it's that type of adjustment and that type of flexibility that the United States government really should be trying to encourage. And instead, unfortunately, we're doing much the opposite, imposing new mandates and new restrictions and new economic nationalist policies that unfortunately are just going to mess up that necessary adjustment process and I think, in fact, make us less competitive vis-a-vis China in the future.
Certainly something we don't need at this time of great challenge. If you'd like to learn more, once again, the report is titled Questioning Industrial Policy, Why Government Manufacturing Plans Are Ineffective and Unnecessary, available at cato.org, I assume. Yeah. Scott Lincicome is Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at Cato. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching.